Africa faces a major housing crisis due to rapid urbanization and a growing slum population. Well, that's according to a new report by the World Bank Group. It says new targeted approaches to affordable housing are necessary. That's if countries want to take advantage of the demographic shift to make cities inclusive, spur economic growth and expand job opportunities. Well, with me, urban specialist from the World Bank, Roland joins me to talk about this new report. Roland, good afternoon. Thanks for coming in.
Good afternoon, Devon. It's good to be here.
Well, you know, we see suffocating challenges of urbanizations in cities like this one, Johannesburg. And I was wondering, according to the report, how bad is the spatial problem and that of service delivery?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that broadly throughout Africa, the continent is fairly early on in its urbanization process. All right. Africa is roughly 40% urbanized now, and so most of the urbanization is still to come. This creates, I think, major opportunities for cities and national governments to get things right in the housing sector and spatially in the spatial organization of cities as well. Thus far, not all the experience has been that encouraging, all right? There certainly are spatial infrastructure and a variety of other problems and deficits, but nonetheless, there are significant opportunities to get this right going forward.
We look at some of the staggering stats there. I mean, 1.2 billion urban dwellers. It's expected to grow. And then you look at the amount of people that have access to actual funds that are needed to actually buy homes. I mean, there we go. Only 5 to 10% of the population can afford formal housing. Right. Those are some staggering figures, aren't they?
Exactly. And we believe this is the primary housing challenge of the time for the sub-Saharan African continent. It's important to realize that this is not a passing phenomenon, all right? Not only are we looking at very large numbers in informal circumstances today, but it's the only region in the world in which informal settlement is expected to grow in future. This, we believe, has major implications for government policy. Government policies need to be directed, firstly, at investment in this challenge. We are recommending that governments increasingly invest in basic services and infrastructure because informal settlements are not going to go away. The primary job of government, particularly if you're addressing the bottom 50, 60, 70% of the population, needs to provide the conditions in which households can gradually move into more and more formal circumstances, upgrade their own dwellings and so on over time. There are also a variety of interventions that government can make in order to ensure that the housing sector as a whole, right across the spectrum, from formal households at the top of the market right through the informal spectrum, works a lot better. For example, in improving the functioning of urban land markets and so on.
Yeah, and I suppose part of that will be heavily discussed at a conference we have underway right here in Johannesburg, the African City Summit. Now, our corporate governance minister said this morning that perhaps national governments should pass on some power to the local governments in order for them to deliver quite directly and have sort of more control in the product at the end of the day. You agree with that?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that local governments in many ways provide the institutional fulcrum on which the whole urbanization process rests. They have absolutely critical responsibilities here, and they will either get these right or they won't in the urbanization process, and managing the process will be a lot less effective than it would otherwise be. Now, we're in South Africa at the moment. South Africa actually has, relative to the rest of the continent, a fairly well-resourced, fairly effectively functioning local government system. There are many challenges, there are many problems, sure, but the basic design of the system, its resourcing, intergovernmental transfers, own source revenues, etc., it's a reasonably good system. Actually, elsewhere in the continent, local governments, with a few exceptions like Uganda, are very much weaker. They have far fewer fiscal resources. We have an increasing problem in which there's a disconnect between the responsibilities in which central governments pass to local governments and the resources which are devolved to local governments to actually meet these responsibilities. Those are core policy and institutional challenges which need to be faced throughout the continent.
All right, the private sector. I mean, in South Africa, we see some low business confidence levels at the moment. You look at our economic growth number, not that impressive, fairly different in the other parts of Africa. But let's just talk about what's needed for encouraging the private sector to get on board here.
Okay, well, with reference specifically to housing, there is a great deal that can be done by governments at the policy level to ensure that markets work more effectively. So just to give some examples. Only 10% of land in Africa is registered, all right? When it comes where you can register land, the registration process in Africa as a proportion of the total value of the property is more expensive than any other region in the world, all right? If government intervenes in order to improve the management of land and the operation of urban markets, for example, through creating fiscal and legal cadastres for land, which outside of South Africa are hardly exist throughout the continent. This will in turn, I think, create the conditions in which you will get much more powerful incentives for investment by the formal private sector in the housing industry, as well as households themselves, who will have greater security of tenure and will therefore themselves have incentives to be able to improve their dwelling and housings over time.
All right, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks indeed. From the World Bank, urban specialist Roland White. Thanks indeed for coming.
Okay, thank you very much, Dylan.